Hello, this is Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson. Now, it's Europe's favourite holiday hotspot and a place that usually conjures up images of sun, sea and sand. But increasingly, the Mediterranean Sea is becoming known for plastic and pollution. Charities, including the Worldwide Fund for Nature, have been sounding alarm bells of late. It estimated that in 2018, the equivalent of almost 34,000 plastic bottles contaminated those blue waters every single minute. So how bad is the damage, and can European nations come together to clean it up? Here with us for today's debate, we have a Green MEP from France, Marie Toussaint. Thanks for being with us.
Hello.
And we also have with us a Maltese MEP, Josiane Coutayard. Hello.
Thank you for the invite, and hi to all.
Thanks for coming. And you're, I ought to say, with the Labour Party in Malta, which is the governing party. And you're both members of the Industry, Research and Energy Committee that deals with a lot of the issues we'll be discussing today. Well, I've just given a bit of a tiny snapshot in my introduction of the environmental problems affecting the Mediterranean. With more detail, here's France 24's Céline Schmidt.
The number one enemy of holiday makers on the Mediterranean coast is probably plastic waste. And for good reason. The Mediterranean is one of the most polluted seas in the world. 600,000 tons, that's the amount of plastic entering the Mediterranean every year. It is like dumping 34,000 plastic bottles into the sea every single minute. According to a report from the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Egypt, Turkey and Italy are largely to blame. They alone are responsible for 2/3 of the plastic waste. Poor waste management is among the root causes of plastic pollution. Among all the plastic waste generated by Mediterranean countries, only 1/6 is recycled. As a result, large plastic fragments suffocate and often kill marine animals. But what concerns scientists the most is the plastic that turns into microparticles. Once eaten by animals, these tiny fragments enter the food chain, threatening both marine species and human health. Even more worrying, there could be more plastic than fish in the Mediterranean by 2050. Why? Overfishing. The Mediterranean is the most overfished sea in the world. During the last 50 years, 1/3 of its fish population disappeared. But one of Mediterranean's most terrible threats is global warming. Given the rapid melting of polar ice, the level of the Mediterranean has been rising up to 3 mm per year since 2006. Rising water levels could directly impact over 40 World Heritage Sites by the year 2100.
So there we go, a bit of an idea of some of the problems, pollution and otherwise affecting the Mediterranean. Marie Toussaint, as a Green MEP, I'd like to come to you first. It's very much a green issue, of course. 600,000 tonnes of plastic going into the Mediterranean each and every year. How big of a problem is this?
Well, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem for the sea in itself, but also for the 500 million of people living around this Mediterranean Sea that we love, and also for all the tourists. What is really striking is that we can add to the plastic pollution the fisheries practices. And what we estimate is that in 2050, so it's in a really close time, there will be more plastic in the Mediterranean Sea than fishes. So we've got a big problem there, and the EU must answer as a whole. Some countries are doing what they can, but we really need a cooperation between the European Mediterranean countries, but also all the countries that are alongside and live alongside this Mediterranean.
Of course, Malta, your home country, is entirely surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the Maltese government, led by the Labour Party, your party, has recently introduced a new plastics strategy. Just looking at some of the pictures we've seen of plastic in the Mediterranean, was it a wake-up call for Malta?
I think it's a wake-up call for everyone at the moment, and we should also continue pushing it on the agenda so that where there are countries or areas which have not realized the problem, how big it is, they'll realize this and will help each other also get through this huge challenge together. I live, yes, in an area surrounded by the sea, and it is a heartache when I go to the sea and I see plastic bottles and plastic material floating there. Apart from not being nice to look at, I know that they're causing a lot of problems as regards marine life, which is important in our ecological system. And after all, it's also causing problems in human health. We're consuming microplastics, which we won't see, but which is harming us. It's harming the marine environment and even for our economy. Look at the waste of millions of euros which are spent in plastics which are not needed. And yes, we should continue pushing this on the agenda, continue working together so that we'll address this huge challenge.
What does that mean for you then, pushing this on the agenda and addressing the challenge? I mean, are we talking about this being a key plank of Europe's Green New Deal? Should there be a whole EU 28 effort on this specific issue?
From my end, when I say that, I mean that this should be a bottom-up approach and an up-bottom approach. So it takes two ways. So it's important to, when to address an issue, we should work with our local councils, with our villages, with our cities, and then with our different member states, and yes, within the EU or other platforms which unite us. Because after all, it's a question which has no borders. Pollution has no borders. This problem has no borders, and we're all facing it. So it's important that we'll continue with our education, but also we'll continue with our initiatives, both at the local, regional, national, EU level, and yes, also at the international level.
That international level is interesting because there's 22 countries bordering the Mediterranean. Only 8 of them are, in fact, EU member states. Is that an issue when it comes to trying to tackle this problem?
Of course, it is like for all the natural commons that we have, because we also know that what's happening in the Mediterranean is due to the country's neighborhood, in the neighborhood, but also to what's happening around the planet. And we have an emergency there. We have an emergency for the Mediterranean Sea. It's one of the seas that are the most polluted. We already count plus 1.5 degrees of raising of the temperatures, and we're going to reach maybe more than 3.5 degrees towards the end of the century. So we have a real emergency, and what it should push us to do, beyond all the things that we can do, is have a global approach of this problem. And we should give a legal status to the Mediterranean Sea, like Colombia gave a status to the Amazonian forest in Colombia. But we need to find juridic and laws to create laws that protect these natural commons. They have rights as well. They have the rights to live, to be protected, that the ecosystems inside can develop themselves. And this is a solution that we can begin by establishing a loan. For instance, Corsica is thinking about giving rights to nature, to ecosystems. So they're working hard right now to do it. So we can begin local and then go global.
Of course, because obviously just one tiny island within the Mediterranean, and in terms of the economic balance, the EU member states obviously much wealthier than many of the other countries that border the
region. That might be, but you know, France forbids the exploitation and exploration of oil offshore in the sea, and this should be done at the Mediterranean level. Like we really have an emergency there, and we should develop the measures that relate to this emergency.
So what body? There's the Union for the Mediterranean. Is that a route that should be taken? Some criticise it as a talking shop.
Yes, but I think that every platform should be utilized. And then, yes, the Union for the Mediterranean is also an important platform, which also the European Union should continue working with. And I think that the member states, which are represented in this Mediterranean Forum, should also make sure that what policies are discussed, that what initiatives are taken that there are in line with the European policies being taken in the European Union. And apart from that, may I also emphasize the importance of working with other emitters. You said, so Corsica may be a tiny island, but first of all, every little tiny island, every little tiny area, every person in the world could help towards addressing this problem. But after all, we have to work with the other emitters apart from Europe, and Europe could take the lead in this.
Well, does Europe have to offer incentives, even? I mean, if I look at some of the countries on the list that border, I mean, you've got obviously, the likes of Libya, where there's almost not really a functioning government or state at the moment. There's many countries that are having great difficulties with their administrations at the moment. Plastic pollution might not be the biggest issue on their agenda.
Mediterranean is a perfect place to illustrate the fact that we have environmental crisis together with social crisis. And we can talk about the thousands of refugees that are dying or trying to flee in the Mediterranean Sea. But when we look at it, also on the EU side, it's also the place where we have the highest rate of unemployment. And this is where we can work together. To solve this environmental crisis, we can imagine a Mediterranean Green Deal, for instance, to change our economy. And this is also, we have a lot of people that are really poor around this Mediterranean, but we still have big boats for tourists that are not even paying taxes for fuels. And we know that fuel is one of the biggest pollutants. So we can act in this direction for a social Mediterranean and for an environmental, respectful Mediterranean.
That kind of thing could have a big impact on Malta, couldn't it? Because tourism is such an important part of your economy.
Yes, tourism is an important part of our economy and of other economies in Europe. Yes, we have to be bold, but I always believe that changes are most effective when they come about through pushing positive initiatives rather than punishing. So I would also appeal for us to continue pushing on the initiative side, because when people do it willingly, when the industry itself realizes how important it is. Let's speak of the maritime sector, the maritime transport sector, which has, after the European policy and the European push towards carbon neutrality, it has followed suit. It has come out with its own targets for 2050.
Is that because they believe it's important
change.
or because they know that they have to make a difference because the rules have changed and there'll be sanctions?
I think that it may be a bit of both, but what I mean is that it's important that the industry drives change along with the legislator. I think it's very effective in that way, and I think we should continue emphasizing this, because we surely also need to look at the opportunities in it. We cannot just say that there's threats, that there's fear, and that economy will suffer. No, there could be a balance. They could work along well together, and I think that the industry should jump into it and take the opportunity to also become having a more efficient, carbon efficient economy, which after all serves us well. We have to keep in mind that we're not there to serve the economy, but the economy is there to serve us as human beings and also us as regards the environment and health and well-being.
Marie Toussaint, do you see that coming true, or is that perhaps a bit optimistic about industry leading the way?
Well, I think we have a real emergency, and I know that the carbon majors, those big polluters who have emitted two-thirds, even more than two-thirds of the CO2 emissions in the last 50 or 60 years, knew about climate change all this time. So right now, since we have an emergency, I don't only trust industry to change by itself. And with the plastic directive on single-use plastic, what we show is that when the European Union decides to do something and to impose norms, then things change. And we need to go further. This is one step. And as you said with this documentary, there is a lot of plastic still in the sea, but also a lot of other pollutants, the fuel, but also toxins that are everywhere around. And we should begin to forbid and not asking questions about it.
Well, just to talk about one other aspect, we do only have a couple of minutes, but fishing, as we said, is a really big issue. There's the plastic pollution that comes in large part from fishing, I think 9%, but also the overfishing that's happening in the Mediterranean. Now, the EU Mediterranean states catch the most fish in this sea, and they have the biggest and most powerful fleet. Is that perhaps a case where we can say, okay, there has to be some kind of capping, there have to be more stringent quotas? What would you suggest to combat this overfishing?
So there could be different initiatives and different ways to tackle it. But the important thing, I think, that the legislator and also the fishermen need to keep in mind that sustainability is good for all. It's like in the industry.
So would you support quotas being smaller for fishing fleets?
I'm not I would not like to commit to one way or another. I think that the important thing is that we look at what works most, and it could be that in certain areas, an initiative works better than in others. So we have to look also at the different areas of the member states, in which solutions could work better or lesser. So in that way, yes, there needs to be address. The way to tackle it is, I think that it's something which should be well discussed, also taking into particular attention the different member states. And the important thing is that we'll move forward. I always say that it's important to have concrete initiatives.
Yeah.
So the way to do them could differ, but they need surely to be concrete and address the problem.
Just briefly, Marie Toussaint, do you think that we're taking too much fish out of the Mediterranean? Should there be limits? Should there be a totally new approach, perhaps?
Of course, we're taking too many fishes out of the Mediterranean. I would like to say three things. First, Mediterranean is one of the only seas in Europe where we don't know exactly the state of biodiversity and the number of fishes. So we should stop relying on the fishing efforts program, but really know how the biodiversity is going there and how we can protect them, maybe with quotas. Secondly, the EU should not begin again to give subsidies to those big fishermen, because we have small fishermen that need to live as well, and we shouldn't help the biggest that kill the most fishes.
So we're not talking about banning fishing by any means. We're talking about limiting things and a new approach.
Yeah, a new approach for the small fishermen. And the last thing I really want to tell you is that I'm going back to my first point, but we need a legal status for the Mediterranean Sea to be able to protect those ecosystems that we depend on.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you both very, very much for taking part in our debate. And thanks to you as well for watching. Hope to see you soon for more editions of Talking Europe on France 24.
Hello and welcome to all of you. Welcome to the special edition of Tech 24 out of Reunion Island. It was once an important stopping point for vessels sailing on the spice trade routes. Today, the French Overseas Department of Reunion Island has a new ambition: to become a regional tech hub, a gateway between Asia, Africa, India, and the rest of Europe.
Tech 24, presented by Julia Seeger on France 24 and France24.com.